The closing bell rang just moments ago. The Dow down on fresh fears over tariffs as a big tech sell-off gains momentum. So let's take a look at our interactive stock market heat map. This is brought to you by FinViz. This is showing the top 500 stocks. It is a sea of red today, fueling the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell telling the Economic Club of Chicago tariffs came in much larger than anticipated, and they will lead to higher inflation. So let's take a listen.
The level of tariff increases announced so far is significantly larger than anticipated, and the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth. Tariffs are highly likely to generate at least a temporary rise in inflation. The inflationary effects could also be more persistent.
CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady joining us now to walk us through what we just heard from Powell and how the markets are responding. Hi, Kelly.
Hey there, Jules. Okay, so kind of three takeaways for me from Fed Chair Powell. One, the sound that you just played, the fact that he said inflation could be persistent. It's not the first time that we have heard him say this, but I want to emphasize Fed Chair Powell chooses his words very carefully. He's very temperate. And so to now hear him start to use that word regularly is a bit of why you saw the markets react so viscerally when he started speaking. The second thing is Powell is a data guy. Okay, he and the Fed, they are driven by data. And every time I have gone there and I have posed questions to him, he said, look, we have to wait for the data. Today, he said that the data from the first quarter shows that economic growth is slowing down. And that, I think, also caused, a little bit of anxiety among investors. And then the final thing is that there is a possibility for stagflation. And I say that because he said, quote, we may find ourselves in the challenging scenario in which our dual mandate goals are in tension. The Fed's two mandates are keeping inflation in check and keeping the labor market and economic growth healthy. When you have those two at odds, that means stagflation. And I just want to play a little bit of sound and when he kind of spelled that out for us.
The administration is, as I mentioned in my remarks, is implementing significant policy changes, and particularly trade now is the focus. And the effects of that are likely to move us away from our goals. So unemployment is likely to go up as the economy slows in all likelihood, and inflation is likely to go up as tariffs find their way, and some part of those tariffs come to be paid by the public.
So, Jules, I mean, you listen to that, you can kind of understand why the market sold off. In fact, at 1:30 p.m. when Fed Chair Powell started speaking, if you looked at the Dow, it went like this. Now, we finished off session lows, but just hearing him say so much uncertainty that we're moving away from their goals potentially with the impact of tariffs spurred a lot of concern.
The soft landing is facing wind shear. At the Federal Reserve, a soft landing is the cliche used to describe the best outcome after economic turbulence. Inflation slows without a recession and job losses. It looked like the Fed's series of rate increases had piloted the economy towards that outcome. But now, tariff chaos is causing sudden, unpredictable shifts in conditions. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell suggested that in a speech today.
These policies are still evolving, and their effects on the economy remain highly uncertain.
Powell's language is technical, dry. It can put colicky babies to sleep. But the word uncertainty suggests a problem.
We may find ourselves in the challenging scenario in which our dual mandate goals are in tension.
The Fed's task is to keep rates low to create as many jobs as possible, but not so low that it triggers inflation. The tension that Powell is talking about is that the uncertainty makes it hard to know how to act. When I spoke with Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee last week, he laid out the dilemma in more easily understood language.
If there's danger of recession, the Fed should cut interest rates. Yes. If prices are rising and inflation's going up, the Fed should raise rates. Yes. If there's a lot of uncertainty, the Fed should wait and do nothing. Yes. And that triangle going around and around, that's the hard part.
The harder the Fed's job, the greater chance households will face rising prices and job insecurity. That brings to mind another cliche. When the Fed raises rates to slow economic activity, it's accused of taking away the punch bowl just as the party gets going. Now tariffs may be yanking the punch bowl away just as the Fed's soft landing party was about to begin.
CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand joins us from the White House this morning with reaction there. Hey, good morning, Natalie. How is President Trump responding to what the Fed chair said?
Yeah, good morning, Errol. Well, we have a brand new post on Truth Social in which the president is attacking Fed Chair Jerome Powell, saying that his report was, quote, wrong, that oil is down, groceries are down, and tariffs are making the United States rich. He's also trying to put pressure on the independent Fed to lower interest rates. But this is in response to those comments. You played a clip of them yesterday in which the Federal Reserve Chair noted uncertainty surrounding the tariff policy, the administration's tariff policy, saying that, you know, it could generate a rise in inflation and a slowdown in economic growth. That's when people start worrying about stagflation. Now, in his remarks, he did note that despite the uncertainty and the risk that currently the economy is still strong, but there's a lot of unknowns that remain. Of course, the Fed's goal is to ensure stable prices and full employment. He said that he's kind of taking a position of waiting at this time. He didn't really give an indicator of where he sees interest rates growing. But, you know, this morning we are getting our initial response from the administration in response to those comments, which saw, you know, the stock market fall following his comments yesterday. We'll have to wait and see what else the White House and the president says this morning.
U.S. stock futures are mixed this morning following a drop yesterday. Indexes were slightly down all day, but dropped significantly in the afternoon after the Fed chair's speech at the Economic Club of Chicago. Jerome Powell warned the president's tariffs could lead to inflation and an economic slowdown. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes is tracking this headline for us. Nancy, good morning to you. The president's fiery response to Powell's comments this morning, I don't think that in and of itself is a surprise, but might there be some actions to come with it?
Well, the president has made it clear for a while, Errol, that he would love to be able to get rid of the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell. He has lodged a number of complaints against him online. He says that he should have lowered interest rates a long time ago. He said this morning that his termination cannot come soon enough. But Jerome Powell is in his position until at least 2026, at which point it is assumed that President Trump will replace him with someone else. But it's not surprising that he is lashing out after the warning that Powell issued yesterday, where he didn't use the word stagflation, but he made it clear that that is what he is most worried about, this rare condition where prices are going up even as unemployment goes up. Typically, those two things don't rise together, but he says that's the impact that Trump's tariffs could very well have.
The president originally nominated Jerome Powell for this post. So does he even really have the power to just unilaterally fire him?
And Chair Powell, Errol, has been asked about this himself and said no, that the president does not have the legal authority to terminate, to fire the president or to remove him except for cause. Although we know and we've seen President Trump, the Trump administration, trying to exert more power over independent agencies, the Fed being one of them. But note in an executive order that the president earlier signed trying to do just that, the Federal Reserve, specifically its monetary policy, was exempt from that executive order. Now, I tried to ask the White House for clarification about that tweet, what exactly the president meant by that. And one of the communications team said, well, we'll have to wait and see what the president says about it later today when he's likely going to be asked about it by reporters. Now, note that Chair Powell's term as chair expires in May of next year, 2026, but his term as member on the board of governors expires in 2028, Errol.
Welcome back. We are following market reaction on the heels of remarks from Fed Chair Jerome Powell. He told the Economic Club of Chicago that tariffs were much larger than anticipated and they will lead to higher inflation. If you missed that yesterday, here it is.
The level of tariff increases announced so far is significantly larger than anticipated, and the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth. Tariffs are highly likely to generate at least a temporary rise in inflation. The inflationary effects could also be more persistent.
Now, many say those remarks from Powell are his starkest warning yet. It even led to losses yesterday in the stock market. And if you look at the Dow Jones right now, it's down. And we know today President Trump is responding. He said, quote, "The European Central Bank is expected to cut interest rates for the 7th time, and yet too late." Jerome Powell of the Fed, who is always too late and wrong, yesterday issued a report which was another and typical complete mess. Trump ends the post with Powell's termination cannot come fast enough. Let's get to CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. Kelly, good to see you today. First off, can you just clear things up for us? Can the Fed chair be terminated? And secondly, do we know why Powell hasn't cut interest rates just yet?
Okay, so let's start with the termination point. So technically, no. It would be illegal for the president to fire Chair Powell without cause. And cause is generally accepted to be something other than, I don't like your monetary policy. So based on what the president has said thus far, most people that I'm talking to don't see that there would be an argument for cause. What's really interesting is if you go back to Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, there was a Supreme Court case. It was Humphrey's Executor versus the United States. And that particular case sort of set the precedent that the president does not have the legal authority to boot the head of the FTC or of the Federal Reserve out of this. Now, there is a court case that is coming up in the Supreme Court this session, actually, and something in terms of how it might come out could impact the president's power to do that. But as of now, no, the president cannot do that. To your second question about why Powell has not cut interest rates, the data hasn't said that essentially we need to. I mean, remember, going back to September, October, we did see interest rate cuts. We actually saw a full percentage point cut over a number of different meetings, and then the Fed has held interest rates steady because there was actually a little bit of an uptick in inflation. Only over the past 2 months have we seen inflation come down a little bit, and there's just this wild card with tariffs. And so Fed Chair Powell has been in very much a wait and see mode as opposed to cutting and then getting into a situation where you do see tariffs increase prices and you don't have that tool at your ready.
Right. And that makes sense. Once you explain it, it really does make sense. We know Powell is concerned tariffs will cause stagflation. Can you explain to us what stagflation is and why it's a threat to the economy?
Yeah. So yesterday in Chair Powell's comments, he highlighted that we could see high inflation and high unemployment. And that is pretty much the main reason why the market sold off in such a dramatic fashion while he was talking. And that is essentially the definition of stagflation. It's when you have inflation that is continuing to creep up, but you also have high unemployment and you have economic growth that is really slowing down. And what's really tough about that situation is that the Federal Reserve utilizes interest rates as a tool to keep those two in check. If you cut interest rates, it spurs growth, it spurs people to go out and buy, they have more money, it's easier to borrow, but that will often raise prices. So if you do that in a situation where you already have high inflation, that's really, really tough, and it essentially doesn't create a good situation. So that's why there's so much concern that if we were to get into a place where you do have high inflation and high unemployment and low growth, there's very little tools that the Fed can use in order to get us out of that situation.
There was also something highly topical at the White House today. Social media posts from the president criticizing the Federal Reserve Board Chairman Jerome Powell, suggesting, and then the White House rapidly tried to nullify that inferred suggestion that the president might fire the chairman of the Federal Reserve. What do we know?
Yeah, look, at issues this, like at the crux of this, Major, is that the president has long been critical, very critical of the Fed chair. He wants him to lower interest rates. He has not. It's something
Federal Reserve is an independent entity in the federal government.
Right, it is, and he has said, he said publicly as much, and then, he did put out that social media post, and then later in comments said, if I want him out, he'll be out. However, of course, speaking to our CBS experts on this issue, you can't do. The president cannot remove a sitting Fed chair. Powell is there until May 2026.
And Powell has said he would resist any effort to force him to resign prematurely.
Yes, and he has said that emphatically, and that this is the role of the Fed.
Has there been any conversations inside the White House that the president has been party to where he has suggested that he would like to engineer Powell's departure earlier than scheduled?
There have been reports that, Kevin Warsh, who is a former member of the Fed Board of Governors, has met with the president on several occasions to discuss that possibility. It's something that we have heard externally on the outside from, stakeholders who are supportive of Trump. That there should be a change. The Secretary of Treasury Bessent has said in a recent interview that they are going to be looking for replacements following the end of his tenure of Powell's
scheduled
tenure.
end of his.
The scheduled end of his tenure. But again, the president was emphatic, even in the Oval Office a little while ago, saying that if I want him out, he'll be out.
Finn Gomez, thank you very much. For more on this, I want to bring in CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. Kelly, I want to play for you sound from Elizabeth Warren, Democrat of Massachusetts, member of the Senate, someone who has in the past raised questions about Jerome Powell's stewardship at the Federal Reserve, but said this: if he were fired prematurely, would cross a very important and injurious line. Let's listen.
I have tangled with him on a regular basis about both regulations and interest rates. But understand this: if Chairman Powell can be fired by the President of the United States, it will crash the markets. I think what he's doing is testing the waters. Does he think he can get away with firing Powell and all of you won't raise any hell about that? He's checking that out, and I'm just saying, for the strength of our country, I hope all of you are pushing back.
Kelly, put this conversation in context.
Well, listen, crash, markets crashing, that is a very extreme word, but the Federal Reserve is independent because, to ask any economist, international or American, they are able to keep prices more stable than they would if you had the sort of influence of Congress or the president. And so, yeah, there is the fear that if you were to have more of this tussle play out and this to actually go down a legal route, which, as Finn said, this would be illegal right now based on the law and based on a precedent set by a Supreme Court case during FDR's term, you would see markets react. Whenever Fed Chair Powell speaks, markets react. So if there was the hint that the president or Congress would have a hand in setting monetary policy, yeah, you could see a response from investors.
Speaking of the Fed chair speaking, he did so yesterday in reference to possible efforts to pressurize him to leave. Let's listen.
We're never going to be influenced by any political pressure. People can say whatever they want. That's fine. That's not a problem. But we will do what we do strictly without consideration of political or any other extraneous factors.
Kelly, that definitely meant to calm the markets.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I sat in the room with Fed Chair Powell a couple of months ago, and someone flat out asked him, would you resign if President Trump asked you to? And he said no. And so, look, I mean, he said a lot of other things during that speech that didn't calm the markets, but certainly Powell has his term until May 2026. And even after that, by the way, Major, he still remains on as a board member at the Fed. So his influence at the Fed legally would go on for quite some time.
So how is the central bank navigating all the back and forth between President Trump, Fed Chair Jerome Powell? We know that they operate independently for a reason. The Fed is supposed to operate regardless of what politics is happening. But certainly, I mean, they can turn on the TV and also see what's happening.
And they can see what happens in the markets, too.
Yeah.
I would say they're navigating this carefully. You have heard Fed Chair Powell say, look, nothing's going to impact the Federal Reserve, rather. I'm not stepping down. I think what's tough here is there's a lot of noise happening. And what the Federal Reserve is focusing on is the impact of these tariffs and whether they're going to keep interest rates steady, raise them, or lower them, depending on how this impacts prices as well as economic growth. And so this back and forth is sort of drawing focus from what their real job is. I don't think you're going to hear anything different from Fed Chair Powell at the next meeting. I think you're going to continue to hear him say, hey, we're independent.
The chairman of the Federal Reserve has run afoul again of President Trump. Jerome Powell said the Trump tariffs could hurt the economy.
Now the president is talking about removing Powell. Weijia Zhang is at the White House.
In the Oval Office, President Trump was asked if he has the power to fire Fed Chair Jerome Powell.
I'm not happy with him. I let him know it, and if I want him out, he'll be out of there real fast, believe me.
That frustration stemmed from Powell's prediction yesterday about the impact of Trump's tariffs.
The level of tariff increases announced so far is significantly larger than anticipated, and the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth.
And from Powell's refusal to lower interest rates at Trump's demand.
I don't think he's doing the job. He's too late, always too late.
The president hasn't explicitly said that he's going to try to fire Jerome Powell. Does he even have the power to do that?
My reading of the law is no. He does not have that power.
Wendy Edelberg worked as an economist under Presidents Bush and Obama, and for the Federal Reserve Board for nearly 5 years.
President Trump continues to talk about what he wants the Fed to do. Even if the Fed doesn't listen, does that make a difference?
It makes a difference if financial markets think that President Trump is having influence. So that's the concern, because even if the Fed stays strong, maintains its independence, you can get these negative effects on financial markets if they lose their trust.
Trump's insults toward Powell unfolded as he was hosting Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, his first meeting with the European leader since he announced steep tariffs on the EU that will go into effect in July if they can't reach a new trade deal with the U.S.
We're going to have very little problem making a deal with Europe or anybody else because we have something that everybody wants.
And Weijia Zhang joins us now. So, Weijia, this is by no means the first time Trump has thought of getting rid of Powell. They have a little history here.
Yeah, even though it was Trump who nominated Powell, he has frequently lashed out at the Fed chair, even calling him the enemy during his first term. And in 2018, Trump actually considered firing him, but the president backed off after the markets tumbled.
Weijia, past presidents have groused about the Fed chairman, but this is a new level, isn't it?
Well, sure, because in the past, presidents, including Trump, have had issue with the decision making. But now the president is making claims about motive. Just today, he, on multiple occasions, accused Powell of, quote, playing politics. Powell insists that the Federal Reserve will never be influenced by political pressure.
President Trump is once again taking aim at his own pick for America's most powerful economic post, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. Despite nominating him in 2017, Trump now wants him out. A century-old precedent blocks this, but a Supreme Court case could change that. CBS's Jan Crawford is in Washington with more. We're going to get to the case in a minute, but why doesn't the president have the power to get rid of Powell at the moment?
Well, I mean, John, because Congress has restricted it. I mean, it's basically said that the president can't remove members or heads of some of these so-called independent federal agencies, including the Federal Reserve, unless there is cause, like misconduct. And that is obviously not the case here.
Tell me about the case in front of the Supreme Court that might change that.
Well, it involves the National Labor Relations Board, which is another one of those so-called independent federal agencies where Congress has specifically restricted the president from firing or removing members. Trump did it anyway. So one of the members sued. Now, Trump argues that he has the power to do this under the Constitution, that these are agencies that perform executive functions. He's the head of the executive branch, and so Congress can't restrict him from removing these members. And I will say, looking back to cases in the past 15 years, there has been some sympathy by some of the justices for those arguments. Now, how does this case affect the Fed? Well, it's a similarly structured agency, so there is real concern that if the court agrees to take up this case, and certainly if Trump wins, then that also could suggest that he could get rid of Jerome Powell as head of the Fed. But again, there have been cases, previous cases, where some of the justices have suggested they see the Fed as different. It's like an historical anomaly. It was created in 1913. So it's a different kind of federal agency. So there is a possibility, even if the court takes up this NLRB case, which I think it will, that it will have some kind of exception for the Federal Reserve, which means Trump would not be able to fire Jerome Powell under the law.